welcome to Directorpiece Theater. Someone free me from my limbo. These hosts are tormenting me.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've never done a real intro.
We never really do an intro. This is Directorpiece Theater.
Oh,
like
yeah.
the guy said.
You did.
Where we talk shop about director speak.
Yes.
Yeah. That's about it. That's what this podcast has become, right?
I mean, we
just
use director
two
words to talk about director speak.
Yeah, with just two old bears talking about,
Yep.
you know, the modes of production and such.
We are old bears. Just ancient bears over
We're
here.
getting up there, man.
You got it, dude. Don't I know it? My birthday's coming up real soon, and it's a big, big number.
And we're gonna get out of hibernation, and it's gonna be great. We're gonna feast on all the seals. It's gonna be great.
Ooh, I'm gonna kill so many seals.
We are bears.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is an Abe episode, Woo.
Which means it's beautiful. Can't wait to see
It's my
its beauty.
favorite types of episodes.
I also enjoy them.
You read the title, and this one is a little different for me. It's less of a thesis. Well, I mean, it's a thesis, but I wanted to inspect, basically, we all kind of had the feeling of, like, you ever notice that the Harry Potter films, like the later ones, like the last four?
Yeah.
Yeah. They feel like dark, and they look the same, and they look like other things happening in the Zeitgeist in like the late 2000s. And there's a reason why. And I'm going to go into, it's not just that the story itself got darker, that was a great motivating reason for why films, let's say, would look dark. But there's a lot of things going on in Hollywood and a lot of people who were essentially getting known for their type of look that Harry Potter mimics. And I want to explain why. To anyone who has that question of why Harry Potter movies feel like, let's say, a Fincher movie.
Yeah.
And why they didn't before.
I mean, right. I feel like this was like actually almost a surface question. Like when they came out, I definitely remember having the feeling, even before I went to film school, that was like, man, these really got heavy. They visually got heavy. And also, I feel like people were kind of talking about that at the time. Am I remembering it correctly?
Immediately apparent because it's a visual aspect.
Yeah.
And visual is something that humans are very good at identifying or acknowledging when they see it and being able to usually put words to what that means. So I'm going to kind of go behind that and talk about like what the mechanizations of the industry and who was making stuff and why they were choosing to like ape those styles.
Exciting.
So I'm going to I'll look at all the films, but I kind of chose one just to make it easier, which is the sixth one, which is Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, which came out in 2009. And I wanted to examine that one and use it kind of as a litmus test for, or an example, a signpost rather, for, this is why it went this way.
This was the movie that very famously, as a book, was spoiled by a T-shirt. Remember they were like T-shirts spoiling this book?
Oh boy, yeah.
Also,
yeah, I didn't read Harry Potter until I had seen those shirts.
Ooh,
by the way,
I want you to know.
So I got it late in the game.
I want you to know I worked at a Borders bookstore when this book was coming out for pre-sale, and we had to stay open till midnight and sell really dumb versions of our drinks with Harry Potter titles while people bought Half-Blood Prince, and I hated it thenceforth, my friend.
Oh,
actually,
well,
I didn't. I really liked the
perfect.
book. I really liked it a lot.
Yeah. Well, you're perfect for this podcast then.
Yes, finally, something for me.
Finally, something for me. So, I want to start with like, let's take a look at Half-Blood Prince. If you look at like the structure, the themes involved, the overall mood and style that it's evoking, and even some of the elements of the story itself, I think there's a fair argument that this is actually what has come to be called a neo-noir.
I'm excited.
And I'll get into exactly what that means, because it's a lot of other things as well. Like, it's a franchise film, it's a blockbuster, it's, even though it's dark, it's still kind of a children's movie. Because after Harry Potter got real dark, after Harry meets Voldemort in the Goblet of Fire, in fact, the visual style of the entire franchise, I would argue, changed in that graveyard during the Triwizard Tournament. Where Robert Pattinson dies. And the remaining films kind of just did that. You know, that darkness. It just, the film quality, like the way it looks and feels, it's that graveyard all the way till the end of the series.
Well,
you know?
You also, I'm sure you're going to talk more about this, but the last 4 Harry Potters were also the only ones directed by the same director.
Yeah, and that's this guy.
Yeah.
This guy.
Yes, correct.
So, David Yates. Because there's a lot of different, even the last movies, there's a dysfunctional indie type movie comes to in my head when I think of Deathly Hallows. The end of the second Deathly Hallow movies has like a Lord of the Rings-esque battle, so it's like pulling all from all the places, you know, which is, you know, I'd say that's typical for like a sweeping hero story in general. It's all over the place. But once Harry's basically on his own, and that starts in this movie, you basically started to notice that these movies look like Fincher films or Michael Mann films. And it's not just the color correction. While the source material was getting darker, it seemed that our cinematic palette at this time, during the 2000s, specifically like mid to late 2000s, our appetites were getting darker, and this movie reflects how those styles were already just happening in Hollywood. And I want to speak to that. As always, most blockbusters are likely to be indicative of a change through reflection of other movies and what's happening around, you know, indie films, or just like more not important films, but films taken more seriously. And blockbusters are not always considered pioneers in their particular genre. I'd say that that's safe to say, right?
Oh, yeah. Most blockbuster movies are an amalgamation of changes. There are exceptions.
Yeah.
But especially like visually and stuff, like they're not usually breaking new ground.
No.
There's like, what's the name of that action movie that was shot, I want to say in the Philippines? The Raid. That's like one of the rare exceptions.
The Raid, yeah.
Because it's technically a blockbuster movie, but it is moving forward
It's
visually.
not an American movie.
That's true.
And I know this isn't an American movie,
Correct.
but it's not like a Western Hollywood type movie.
Good counterpoint.
Which this is.
Yeah, good counterpoint. No, I think you're right.
I want to make a note though before we begin, because I want to speak why I thought this was kind of timely, or why I'm talking about Harry Potter right now, which is, just like a week ago, as of the recording of this stuff, there's like more unwelcome reminders on Twitter about how J.K. Rowling is still just carpet bombing trash opinions left and right. So I decided to take a look at the films again to see like what was there, because I hadn't seen them in a while. And I was going to look at how the films pushed like the disrespect for trans men and women, and how it like set up its like gender archetypes. But frankly, it's no more or less what's happening throughout the 1990s and 2000s by many movies, in my opinion. And I think it's like a generational problem. And the fact, and its stupidity and outdatedness won't really take a role in this particular examination, though it's extremely relevant to remember, and it's just as relevant as the Harry Potter's franchise was to culture and kids / young adults in the 2000s. I wanted to say that up top, just so it's not like that's why we're talking about Harry Potter. Abe decided to watch Harry Potter. But yeah,
I mean,
I want to talk about neo-noir though.
It's unfortunate for her that she's chosen to continue to voice these opinions, because ultimately we may remember the series more for them in the long term than for the other incredible qualities that the series has. I mean,
I think that this podcast isn't for,
social
Abe, the white guy, having his social opinions being heard as much. But you're absolutely right. I personally agree. And this, I want just to look at, I think it's just, that's the passing of the guard. That's old people being old. and getting increasingly out of touch with even the people that they were speaking to, within a matter of less than 10 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, I want to talk about neo-noir and what neo-noir is, because I think that there's still a lot of discussion about what that actually means. And I would say that if you just go to Wikipedia or you just go to any film website that discusses genres of films, you're going to look at in the 2000s, there were a lot of what is quote unquote called a neo-noir, including things like, think of Memento, Training Day, Old Boy, Collateral, Brick, Gone Baby Gone, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. All these films can be described as noirs, but they have a lot of things that they are absolutely not noir about, and that's why we created a new term for it. And I'd say that the term was probably coined before the 2000s. I don't know the first iteration of it, but it definitely became a thing with some specific filmmakers and the themes and conversations they wish to have with their movies, and the fact that they did well made this kind of positive feedback loop that made that the audience was more hungry for these kinds of darker themes.
I love that you're including Training Day in this. I've never thought about.
You wouldn't?
No. I would. I've just never thought of Training Day
thought about it
as
that way?
this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's definitely.
I might be wrong about this. I think neo-noir actually goes all the way back to the 60s. I think that's the traditional dividing line. I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, it's like a reaction to noir, which was fairly dead in the 60s.
Right.
But, there's still noirs being made.
They still made Clute.
Let's talk about how people and critics define neo-noir. Mm-hmm. And, of course, you have to start that by talking about what noir is, and therefore how neo-noir is that and also not that. So modern telling let's start with like the story and the idea of the protagonist of a noir. Modern retellings of noir are not confined to like the femme fatale, like Ray Chandler-esque narratives of classic noir, where like a lady shows up at a doorstep and she's both going to be a foil for the, protagonist, but also kind of ignite us on this like thread of mystery that like we see through to the end. Though it came to being, I would say neo-noir came to being from a love for those styles specifically, and the narrative devices that noir kind of coined. It's kind of like in this generation, they're kind of a love note for the darker themes of noir mysteries, and then how they're always uniquely suited for the protagonist. I think that that's very important. It's one of the main differences between modern mysteries and modern neo-noirs. It's not just a detective story about a detective solving a crime. It's often about a tortured main character finding their own identity through solving a crime. Usually that's because they're involved somehow, or at the heart of the mystery, or because it deals with the themes and the problems coming out of like where that protagonist is at the starting point of the film, and where they are at the end. Let's talk about so why is neo-noir a thing? Well, let's talk about narrative structures and devices, because this is the kind of stuff, this is the love note stuff. Often mysteries are very maze-like and deal in heavy doses of neglecting dramatic irony. That's one of the devices. And neglecting dramatic irony would be another way of saying that, is that what the audience doesn't know, because dramatic irony is something that the audience knows that not necessarily all the characters do, right? Points for my English teacher. All right.
I've written it down in the journal for things to praise you about later.
Yeah. For this reason, we typically see devices like flashback, nonlinear chronology, meaning like the film itself is out of time, the editing itself is out of time. You're going to have a lot of hard cuts and jumping around in terms of okay, so tonally that's not synchronous with what was happening before, because it kind of wants to jolt you out of this idea that what you're seeing is reliable. And that kind of also speaks about narration of the main character specifically. In noir, it always came from this aspect of it's coming from this one private dick that's telling you the story from their point of view, and often some of the best noirs were that character is unreliable for some reason. We got those unreliable narrators and protagonists usually with things like alcoholism. Sometimes they have amnesia. I'm looking at Memento, for example, is a neo-noir version of that. Mm-hmm. It's usually some kind of reality altering aspect to the story. For example, it doesn't have to be internal. It can also be something like Chinatown, where the mystery at the heart of the mystery is something that it's so fundamentally crazy, an aspect of the mystery, that Jake was unable to see it. You know, the fact that there was like that incestuous kind of like story going on,
and it's alluring. It lures our already hard-boiled character for one reason or the other in. You know, like, and
this makes sense when you look back in noir. Honestly, there's been books written about why in a post-war society, you know, in like late 40s, 50s, you had a lot of writers and directors coming back, possibly with PTSD, definitely with some form of like guilt, taking a design procedural tale of the detective story and fusing it with like self-examination and loathing. Yeah. Right? Does that scan?
Oh, I mean, especially for like Billy Wilder or like people like that who were really directly impacted by the war.
Think of Bogart's entire career.
Yeah. Oh, God. Yeah, exactly. And
so that kind of, I want to itemize those two things, the story and the protagonist, and kind of like the stylistic, or rather the narrative structures and devices that are used. Because in the end, I think noir and what neo-noir loved about noir and why it's like we were looking for a fresh update is because of noir is densely occupies style, setting, moods, and themes. Those are the things that I think noir and neo-noir really do share, because noir seems to set itself on like American cultural touchstones. Like it'd always be like a Chicago or New York or something like that. Neo-noir is free from that limitation, as we saw in the early 2000s and even all the way to the 2000s to like early 2010s. They can happen anywhere. Few took place in like schools or in spaces that would be laughable for a classic noir, right?
Yeah, but and they sort of returned to being a noir in the classic sense. Because like you and I have both had a lot of conversations about noir films in the 90s, and they're mostly parodies. Like they didn't do that many noir films that were like you took on your face value. Like for instance, we've talked about Basic Instinct and Ace Ventura, and also Big Lebowski. All of those are noir films. According to this definition, but none of them are playing it as a noir film.
They take out the hard-boiledness of it and kind of laugh at the fact that it's like they're laughing at the exact thing that I'm kind of talking about.
Right. And the look, because they don't have the look of a noir film.
Yeah. It doesn't. So that is what I think neo-noirs loved about noirs, or at least the films and the directors I'm going to be talking about today. They fell in love with the stylistic approaches of noir, and therefore that's what's similar about noir and neo-noir is the style approach. And what I mean by that is like noir settings are almost always shadowy interiors, dingy offices, dark rain-lashed streets. Lighting was typically half or quarter light to put faces and spaces into ambiguity and like set this mood of like a bleak, kind of pessimistic atmosphere, right?
Love that shit. It's like my favorite.
So that's all mood and tone.
Yeah.
Often the angular compositions of noir frames are very stark and claustrophobic that add to the punishment of the characters, because if you're in pessimism world, you're going to want all of your characters in turmoil or punishment, right? I found a good quote from Lee Horsley, who's a noir scholar. He has a good book on it, which I'll put in the description. Quote, both literary and cinematic noir are defined by 1, the subjective point of view, 2, the shifting roles of the protagonist, 3, the ill-fated relationship between protagonist and society, parenthetical, generating the themes of alienation and entrapment, and 4, the ways in which noir functions as a socio-political critique. So those 4 points are kind of how I'm going to examine how Half-Blood Prince really actually is a neo-noir.
I'm so excited about this.
So let's start with Harry Potter and Half-Blood Prince, or HBP as I like to call it, as we all call it in the biz, right?
Get out of here.
Yeah, let's start with narrative structures. The mystery itself in Half-Blood Prince is kind of got multiple threads, right? It's got who's the Half-Blood Prince, that kind of comes up later. Who's cursing students, that's kind of earlier. What are Malfoy? I call him Malfoy. Malfoy, Draco, and Death Eaters. What are they? What's that whole subplot? What are they doing in secret? What's this whole cupboard in the room of requirement? And at the heart of it, which is kind of actually posed in the previous film, what is Voldemort's secret weapon? So that's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And it's all kind of surrounding like what, all right, everyone's posturing for the big battle later. Who's in play? What are the major players going on in here? And these are all big questions, and they all have kind of one basic answer in the end, which is typical of noir or neo-noir. But these are narrative structures wise, many questions, many red herrings, right?
Yeah, or
So
threads that lead to one greater answer, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
or nothing at all.
Yeah.
We have two devices that teleport the movie into flashbacks and narration in the later films. That's the pensieve, which in this movie, that's pretty big deal, because that's the bowl of memories that like Harry can put his head into and see like what happened. In the previous film, there's occlumency. I don't even know how to say that word. Occlumency? Occlumency?
This is the defense.
That's the
stuff?
thing that he's doing. Yeah, it's like his lessons with Snape.
Right, to close his mind, right?
Yeah, it's to take us back into moments of histories or trials. Like, honestly, sometimes in the books, they're like fiction, you know, that just are testing Harry's mental fortitude. So once again, noir, we see this mental fortitude being tested, and we see these out-of-body experiences or this lack of reliable like pseudo-narrative being designed by the film. Like, oh, we're revealing at the heart of the mystery, the thing that you thought was true, not true, it's this other thing. And on top of everything, he's starting to lose his grasp with reality as he kind of falls into the hole of like, how close am I to Voldemort? Am I like more of a Voldemort, you know?
Yeah.
Again, people get drunk and poisoned in this movie. Ron with the love potion, again, done with sinister means. Harry literally takes a luck potion at one point to steer him through an unlikely series of events that benefit like his understanding of the mystery at the heart of the tale. The first crime in the movie, the cursing of Katie Bell, is done with a necklace that's cursed. Dumbledore drinks the zombie water at the end of the film.
Yeah.
All these alter the persons who drinks them or is being cursed, like, or wears them, in like a noir-esque fashion. They all boil down to one question: what did Voldemort do to himself and what is a Horcrux?
Yeah.
And it's all about the transmogrification of self. It's about the alteration of self.
It's also like just nowhere near as fun as it was in previous movies. Like
because we're not talking about like, when guy on Leviosa.
Right.
It's like it's none of this fucking chandelier business.
But
with like, what are the candles?
The funny thing about this movie is it actually has more of the school stuff in it than the previous two had, and yet like it has things like like dating and stuff, and yet because of the subject matter and the way it's treated, it kind of just washes past you. You know, like the fact that Ron and Hermione just are have boners for each other, it like kind of doesn't matter that much because of the grim vibe of this movie, right? Did you feel that?
Yeah, you can't really enjoy. It's kind of like what it is now, like life now. You can't enjoy things to their fullest because you're kind of reminded about the world.
But also like the way that Katie's curse happens, right? She's like held in a crucifix in the
Horrifying.
air. Yeah, really scary. The way that the curse that Harry strikes Draco with is like really scary. And Ron's choking is really scary. Like they're not funny, like, oh, you blew up your face, Seamus. It's not like that. It's very
exactly.
Dark. Yeah.
Although we do get a good Seamus blow
Always,
up in this
right?
one.
It's a bit
at the top, getting in potions. It's a Harry Potter baby. I want to talk about color, cinematography, and lighting, and this is probably what most people who are just watching Harry Potters and not like wanting to think about like how these things, the mechanizations of like what the directors were thinking, etc. This is what they're probably going to respond most to. Again, I have no idea. But it's desaturation, low fill lighting, meaning not a lot of light on the side of their faces that are not the bright side. That side, a little bit darker. You have natural bright sources that bloom in this film, and that's due to a color correction effect that kind of pulls the midtones and highlights out, meaning making those themselves brighter, less bright in order to kind of get that dark vibe that you're talking about. There's no, if you watch this movie and put it through like a computer, I'm pretty sure there's not one pixel that is 100% white. You know, that is 255 white.
It feels like Batman the
white.
Animated Series or something. Like,
I mean, it feels like Batman Begins, but more on that later.
Right, obviously. But like Batman the Animated Series, like famously, they started with a black page, right, and then added color to it. Sometimes it feels like that in this movie, where it's like it starts with dark and they add light to it, not the other way around.
Yeah, and I want to point out that that's different from stark, because stark
Right.
is a word that we give to contrast. Contrast meaning the distance between two things, as opposed to this, which is kind of muting. There's a muting that is occurring in the color correction and in the cinematography. These lighting techniques and post-production techniques were in full swing during this entire decade. And just to, kind of open that little piece of history, after the Coen brothers' Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, which was the first film to use a digital intermediate. And what that means is that they essentially took photos, digital photos of every single frame, even though they shot it on film, and then could streamline the color grading process into a completely digital one. So they didn't have to put like film into baths of chemicals and such. So a lot of films during this decade did this because they saw it, and therefore it kind of had a baked-in look. Like, it's reminiscent of like an Instagram filter, for example. There's even professional color grading softwares that have presets that you can just drag and drop to establish these kinds of looks. Like, this is industry standard kind of stuff. It's not too different from, let's say, choosing a film stock in the old days. Like, if you take a film stock like Ektachrome or Double X black and white, which is very contrasty kind of look, think of Pi or even like Eraserhead. Ektachrome, think of like Easy Rider or like any film from the 60s, gosh. That is like, love and hippies and shit. Like, they chose that shit because it caused them to think about those kinds of things. Ektachrome made me think of sunsets and natural colors and earth tones.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to think of things like, I don't know, Woodstock and shit. But it's just easy and precise now.
Yeah.
Now, with color correction, we can do this shit.
I was thinking of Saving Private Ryan when you mentioned this, because I was like, well, didn't that movie do it? But they actually, it turns out they did a bleach bypass for the negative.
Bleach bypass. Right. Which is what this is mimicking.
It is, but it's not...
But not quite.
Right. It's a lot... You're saying the word's precise, and I think that's right, because it doesn't just wash the image out. Like, they're also... It's almost like they're giving it like fingers of darkness where there aren't any in the image, and it's beautiful,
Imagine like this. With the analog version, bleach bypass means that you're literally giving... there's several points to what a bleach bypass is, but one of the aspects is that you use bleach as a chemical that allows some aspects of the silver nitrate to continue through the process and some to be blocked. So that's why it's a bypass. It's like a stopgap on some aspects that bleach has an effective look for. But bleach is an organic kind of material, or not an organic material, but it's a chemical that it influences things because you put it in there. It's like acid or something like that. It's just going to react to what you're throwing into it. So even if you dilute this solution and such, you can dial it in. It's still going to be the same beast it's going to be, and you're always going to be beholden to those chemical processes. No longer is that true. After the digital intermediate kind of came into being, you could say, yeah, I want to fuck with the highlights, but I also want to fuck with the midtones differently. And I want to, in the middle of highlights and midtones, add another curve. I want to do a lot of little precision kind of things that don't exist in the analog world, really. So that's kind of my, hey, that's what's going on in terms of the tech side.
Interesting.
Let's get back to what the approach was from a cinematography point of view. A lot of long lenses are a thing in this movie. Not long lenses in the sense that people are shooting on 85s or 100s, which means that they're like really zoomed in telephoto. But like even their wide shots are like in the middle distance.
Yeah.
Like instead of using a 24 millimeter, you're using like a 40. And what that does, like if you it makes like a lot of neo-noirs do this. Nolan, Mann, Fincher, they all love lenses in this kind of middle space because there's an emphasis on soft backgrounds. It kind of compresses the space, which is what telephoto lenses do, but not a ton, just a little bit more than a 35. Maybe put on that 40. Maybe instead of, I want a wide angle, let's maybe not use the 20 millimeter. Let's use the 24. It's like, and if you look at the action sequences, which usually play in wider angles, you get the feeling of like the Bourne ultimatums kind of coming in. And I'm not just talking about the editorial style, because that's by far the biggest thing that you take away from the Bourne films is that it's just action. It's an action sequence. Cut. But I'm talking about, they're shooting on, it's not, it's Matt Damon's shoulder. It's a shot of his shoulder. It's like not doing much. And it's because they're zooming in a little bit for all, they're just changing the focal length. So yeah, emphasis on softer backgrounds. It forces the compression to condense the composition. It makes larger and deeper backgrounds to become like clearer lines in the background. Now, what I mean by that is they're not crisp lines. Crisp is different from clear in my head, because crisp would be that it would be like everything's in focus. When I say clear is that when you have this blurring effect, it's imagine someone like a painter coming in with a larger brush that is just like, I have a single brush stroke that represents like the incline of a mountain. That's just done with a mountain can be drawn with two, intersecting lines, right?
Yes.
So that's a clear indication of like a mountain. By blurring all of the stuff behind the actors, and there's a lot of stuff in this movie. There's, always hallways with a bunch of stuff. There's rooms with like, for no reason, like look at the room of requirement. There's just chairs everywhere for no reason, stacked on stacks on stacks and stacks. Let's not make that feel cluttered. Let's kind of blur it a little bit so that it's kind of just like, it's just kind of a wash of like brown over here. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
so it's like clearer indications of what space is in the 2D frame.
Yeah, he also uses a lot of what you might call abstract space. So and I think he uses the long lens that you're talking about to accomplish it. So like the best example is Harry comes back to the Weasley house unannounced because Dumbledore drops him off there, right? And then like great example. Ginny comes in and she's like, "Did you know Harry was here?" And they have this shot that's looking up at the Weasley weird palace, and you can't really tell where anybody is in it because the staircase and the lines are all very abstract. So it's hard to say where you can't get your bearings about how far up things are. And to use that effect, people's heads keep popping up asking, "Oh, Harry's here." And then another person, "Oh, Harry's here." And they're all at a different distance from camera. So it's funny. It's like a funny shot, but it also reinforces this idea of like just a mountain of clutter and not having a clear sense of depth.
Or geography.
Yes.
I think that's one of the strongest aspects of like first time directing a Harry Potter. He knew that even look at like Order of the Phoenix, the geography was very clear in that movie about, okay, this hallway leads to this hallway. They think about, once again, the room of requirement, like the sequence where Filch is like trying to find them and see where they're going. Like it's all about passing the camera to the next hallway and the next hallway and like tracking the spaces. This very smartly goes, everyone knows it's like Hogwarts, baby. Like everyone knows we don't need to see the connective tissue. Yes. We can just like jump right there. And you're right. There's a form of abstraction of Hogwarts in this movie.
They use a lot of a lot of shots that if Kubrick had shot them, they'd be this gigantic wide lens like hallway deep space shots. And instead what he does is he sort of puts him on the far edge of the frame, which I know you're going to talk about, and uses the hallway as kind of a big loud mess to make the characters feel alienated. And he shoots it on kind of a longer lens, so it doesn't have the Kubrick effect. It has the effect of feeling like the frame is a big block and the person's trapped in it. He does that a lot, and it's actually quite beautiful. You know?
And it's not the first filmmaker to kind of think about that, and kind of more on that later. The last thing I want to talk about Half-Blood Prince in specific is it's relative to neo-noir and the stylistic approaches is well, not the stylistic approaches, but like the first thing that I was talking about with noir, the protagonist and like the story beats and why this is. And this is more of like, I guess, J.K. Rowling's influence. When we see the noir themes at play, mysteries that reveal aspects of the protagonist's identity, guilt over actions of the self, general pessimism by everyone, or the feeling of alienation of the protagonist against society, Half-Blood Prince has it all. All of those things, there's check marks for that. And just watch the film, you know? At the heart of the story is Harry's guilt over becoming more like Voldemort, right? Like in Order of the Phoenix, when he uses, at the very end of that film, he uses the Cruciatus curse, which is like the torture curse on Helena Bonham Carter.
Yeah.
And like, by the way, no one mentions that because no one really saw, but like, that's also, she doesn't mention it. Like, you just did an unforgivable curse. You basically are Voldemort at this point, or Death Eater. He just does it and gets away with it. But then he doesn't get away with it when he freely uses like Sectum Sempra, which is what you pointed out.
Pretty brutal too.
The Half-Blood Prince. Yeah. Because it eviscerates flesh, right? Cuts up Draco. Yeah. And then he tries to use it again on Snape at the end.
He does.
So he's battling his ability to be less like Tom Riddle, right? So there's all of those themes in one little nice bundle.
Also, this is a movie where Dumbledore asks Harry Potter to do morally gray things, which he has not asked him to do for the most part until now. So, like, the most morally gray thing is Harry is brought along to manipulate Slughorn into giving him information that they need, right? And like, it's
to be collected.
Yes, and like, it's partly playing along with Slughorn's game, but it's also partly like very clear dishonest manipulation. And Harry eventually not only gets wise to it, but agrees and takes it even further, which is kind of a dark thing. And then probably the darkest thing in any of the films really is like him forcing the poison down Dumbledore's throat, which Dumbledore asks him to do, and you know, you understand it's magic, but as it changes him, grim. He's like, no,
it's grim. It's grim. It's real grim, and he's fighting zombies. Yep. Absolutely, all bundling up. It's all kind of, I think, all in all, there's a strong case for Half-Blood Prince being a neo-noir, and at the minimum, heavily influenced by that genre, both the book and the movie I'm talking about. I think that that's important because there's a lot of auteur filmmakers and popular filmmakers during this time, the middle, 2000s and on, that neo-noir was their bread and butter, and one that keeps coming to mind is Fincher.
Sure.
So I want to talk about Fincher and like the 2000s drab visual style and how he kind of took it and ran with it. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of like the snake eating itself a little bit. Who knows if he or the chicken and the egg is probably a better example of it. Either he was well suited for the time or his movies transformed the time, or both. Something's going on there. One element of Fincher's visual style, for example, is the specific way in which he uses camera, how he tilts, pans, and tracks in camera movement. When a character is in motion or expressing emotions, the camera typically moves at the exact same speed, or sometimes what we call a sympathetic speed, or as their body is kind of moving. These movements are choreographed precisely between the actors and the camera operators. This is a Fincher, bread and butter kind of thing. The resulting effect is to help the audience connect with the character or to understand their feelings, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of moments in Half-Blood Prince that remind me of this. The beginning, there's a post-title sequence where it shows downtown London being ravaged by Death Eaters. And there's a long CG camera tracking shot that goes to and fro through bridges, alleys, streets, and buildings, and then goes into one particular building. Much like Panic Room's famous through the house sequence, right? So now we're kind of starting to tell on ourselves. Another one is when Potter talks to Katie Bell after she's healed, we track with Harry as he approaches Katie, and then Katie looks at Draco, and the camera kind of opens up and then cuts to a new sympathetic speed entirely of its own that's much slower, more unsure of itself, kind of wonky and like wobbly. And that's because it's Draco's camera now, and as he backs up and runs away, we kind of follow with him. The entire Felix Felicitas sequence when he takes the luck drink, it's slightly lower angled, Steadicam shots. So you feel, by putting it low, you feel Harry's confidence because he's up a little higher than usual. So we're looking up at him. He has more power. And and you feel that confidence as he's walking through the halls. And then also the interruption of when Slughorn is like stealing buds in the greenhouse. It reminds me a lot of how Fincher covers walk and talks. Like in Zodiac, when we look at how the office sequences are constructed, we follow people and it kind of like passes between to get like the bustle of the office. Then they kind of cut and pass to the momentum to another person. So it's this like constantly moving ball that like matches the speed of the person who's wielding it. And that happens a lot in this movie.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, is that there's a lot of camera similarities in what Yates is doing with what Fincher does. Another thing is color. Again, seems obvious. With Fincher, especially in his later work, you get that Instagram filter vibe I was talking about, probably most famously in The Social Contract or Gone Girl. Think of like an ultra thin scrap of wax paper, like over the entire frame, that kind of mutes and like blurs everything. There's a halination effect. That's what it's called. And they would actually accomplish that by putting pantyhose on the back of the glass of the lens, like in the back focus space, like where it opens up and there's a gate, and that's where the film runs through. Yeah, that's how they would affect it. They would essentially take nail polisher and like glue it on and then slam the lenses on there.
That's fascinating.
And that's how you get a little bit of like soap opera-y, but it wouldn't be over dramatic. You'd pick thinner hose and such. But anyway, Fincher's visual style, which includes that kind of stuff, uses like monochromatic and desaturated colors. He loves blue, greens, yellows. And that kind of represents and that's like through all of his movies. He kind of represents, that's how he kind of sees the world. And honestly, that color strategy looks a lot better here than some of his films, especially his earlier films. Probably first explored in Panic Room is when he started doing that color effect. I mean, it's to a lesser extent Fight Club.
Yeah, Fight Club.
But Fight Club is stark and contrasty, and it's it feels more like a 90s film. I don't know.
What about Seven?
It didn't have the benefit of the DI, the digital intermediate. So it wasn't as precise in its approach to like blacks and midtones and whites, right?
Definitely. What about Seven?
Yeah, that's the same kind of situation though. Like they didn't have the benefit of that DI. That looks a lot like Fight Club in my opinion. But it's got that griminess.
Yeah.
So it's there from the beginning with Fincher. But it's almost after this film when Fincher started really going, okay, this is how, like, look at Gone Girl, look at Zodiac.
Right.
Once he had control of color correction, he was like, nah, this is the way it goes. And it looks very similar. And I think the reason that I would argue that Harry Potter looks a little better is that, the budgets are insanely high. Right. So they can fill the castle with a bunch of stuff. So there's many natural windows. There's sconces on the walls. The walls themselves have beautiful definition because they're stone. There's a bunch of bookcases and trinkets, and it's all Harry Potter with cauldrons all on the frame. And then compare that to like a Fincher thing where it's a suburban house or like an office. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a way in which they separate, because there's drab in Finch's worlds. There's whimsy in Harry Potter, yet the similarities in the visual style come from the darkness of the frames and the themes. Another aspect that I think caused this visual definition of the late 2000s was introductions of cameras like the Red camera, which took the indie market by storm in like the mid 2000s. There was a time frame like 2005 to 2011 where we really all identified that aged photo chroma starved look as something that was indicative of the indie, smaller, humble films with dark themes, because the Red camera just looks like that. Like that's just an affectation. They shoot pretty flatly, meaning they like try to represent as much as the dynamic ranges of a camera can. and people kind of liked it. And they were like, you know what? Let's not like make it look like film. Let's use this tool and make it look like I kind of like this look. And there's probably a whole book or at least a lecture on like our half-decade visual fascination on the medium of just the fact that the medium of video changed and became like a real contender and like took over film, and why that like informed our tastes. But its reach really knows no bounds. It's still to this day influenced Guillermo del Toro immediately, Wes Anderson immediately. It still influences TV today. Lovecraft Country is still on HBO right now. And you can't tell me that that doesn't look like a red camera.
True.
Even if it's not. I absolutely think it's probably shot on the Alexa or something. Visual side, Half-Blood Prince is much more symmetrical film than Fincher would make, so I'm not going to go to bat and say like it's a mock-up of Fincher's work, because like there's a lot of things that are different, like Fincher's angular momentum and framing, which is another way of saying like large shapes and frame fragmenting the frame. He's a lot more stark. There's both claustrophobic films in a way, but the angles are like more acute or obtuse. Like they're strangely oblong or confining, and he uses the frame space, like the horizontal real estate, to like really push someone on the side or really put them in the center. He doesn't like the thirds as much. Well, Half-Blood Prince is like a, Hollywood feature. So it's going to stick on the thirds, because that's just convention. Half-Blood Prince doesn't really cant or Dutch its angles. It does take moments, usually like the emotional resonant moments, to short frame and use that horizontal dominance that I was just talking about. Like traditionally we obey the thirds, right? But if you look at, like, for example, when Harry and Ginny connect in the requirement room and they have their kind of first time that they actually are alone and talking to each other after their love has started to blossom, they're placed way far on the right of frame. And this is something I noticed that Yates does in emotional scenes. He chooses to cover them more unconventionally. I think that's kind of comes from indie features too, which do things unconventionally. And he's like, yeah, let's pick up the indie dial a little bit more. But, if it's just a dialogue scene between him and Snape, it's going to be like basic coverage.
I think he's more confident in this film. That's a big part of it, because it's his third one, right? This is the third film he made for Harry Potter, right?
Wait, no.
Yeah, are you sure? I think
this
it is
his first. So the way it works is there's Christopher Columbus for 1 and 2, and then Prisoner of Azkaban was Alfonso Cuarón.
Right.
And then Mike Newell took over for what's it called? Goblet of Fire.
Oh.
Yeah, actually, no, you're right. It must be the second then, because Mike Newell must have directed Order of Phoenix. Or not Mike Newell. David Yates must have directed that. And he kind of owns all of the dark space. Like the movies that we're talking about, that's all Yates.
Interesting. I guess I thought that Yates took over with the fourth movie.
No, that's Mike Newell who did Goblet of Fire. I
realize that. Okay, I see.
And that's like, Cuarón is really the one who kind of changed it, which is hilarious because Prisoner of Azkaban, which was 2004, the movie before that was Y Tu Mama Tambien.
Which is fucking great, by the way. Great movie.
Right. And then after Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, his movie 2 years later was Children of Men, and then Gravity.
Yeah, wow.
So he really is an auteur that they darkened it up, but then Mike Newell kind of just honestly kind of mimicked what he did, and then in the ending sequences ramped it up, and then it was Yates who had to kind of take those reins and drive it home. And that's an interesting aspect of, there's a whole conversation about how directors in a franchise have to kind of pass things and live in their own embedded world that someone else built.
Right.
But that's not what this is about. I want to mention, just as an aside, because it's not that I don't acknowledge them, I just chose Fincher because he is like, all of his films are neo-noir. Michael Mann is another great touchstone, Collateral and Miami Vice. A lot of what he was doing with the color brightness aspects that I've been talking about, Michael Mann kind of predated all of them. Christopher Nolan's in there. He definitely had the biggest impact. And after 2005 and Batman Begins, we basically saw how desaturation and the bleach bypass look could serve more than just period pieces like Saving Private Ryan, which is what you mentioned. Like, he said, oh, yeah, but like that look, but like now. But like it's not a period piece, you know? It's not a flashback to history, which is almost exclusively how bleach bypass was used at that time.
Right.
To create an like otherworldly effect, to create a, you know, like in back in the day, you know, kind of thing.
Right. It's supposed to conjure a sense of antiquity.
Right. And I'd say that the modernization of this look still is being felt today.
Sure. Sure.
So another thing I want to talk about the 2000s is nonlinear editing and how that influenced the neo-noir and some of the things that we're talking about. So like the camera technology, like the Red, films began to be edited in a nonlinear format. So there's the Avid, which I know, Adam, you're well familiar with because we both used Avid Media Composer in our film school, which was like, consider that like, I guess to make Adam happy, the Los Angeles Lakers.
Yeah, baby!
It was the industry standard, couldn't be touched. Everyone used it for decades. And even when computers started happening, like Media Composer was developed and they still used Avid. They just trust Avid.
Yes.
Filmmakers loved
also,
Avid.
Avid's about to win a championship this year, as just like the Lakers are. Same thing.
And it was used by TV too. It was just industry standard. And the toolkit itself, even in the digital format, is reminiscent of a movie vola, meaning like, all right, advance the tape, cut, glue, advance the tape, cut, glue, splice. So it's coming from that world because it was dealing with editors, film editors, who were literally working with film tape. And they were like, well, we got to make that make sense for those people, right? And then when we actually were going to film school, Final Cut, Adobe Premiere, Vegas, these softwares treated clips of footage like layers in Photoshop. You can stack them on top of each other. Who cares? Who gives a fuck? You have complete control. It's not that Avid Media Composer doesn't have that ability to some extent, but they catered to the industry they were born into, and they were the earliest born. So the prosumer indie professional market that like you and I came out of wasn't a thing when they built that software infrastructure. Now this may not be that interesting, but like when you edit an Avid circa 2005, it was like treating regions or clips or like, all right, the cut from here to here and it's one continuous shot. Like it treated it like a draggable series of tapes. It's reel-based editing. And that made a learning curve for some kid who grew up with Photoshop and Adobe suites and, you know, MS Paint and computers that just allow you to do whatever. It's not very intuitive. No. And that they had kind of reached that plateau. So you saw the new blood enter the industry with the savvy that was just auxiliary. And with the continued like democratization of the tools, DSLRs, Final Cut you could just buy, third-party lens adapters, you can make your video look like film a little bit, stabilizers you could build yourself with PVC pipe. You know, the movement of the medium changed. And in like 3 to 5 years, a blink in the eye in terms of like the next biggest thing in terms of filmmaking, that developed cinema completely different from where cinema began. And we had professionals reflecting that new tool set. So, and it's still happening, you know, like we're going to have, I mean, I can't even call it, but like we're going to, you know, we're absolutely going to make augmented reality films, for example. Sure. It's just an ever-changing medium, as it should be.
And there's some filmmakers were always sort of savvy to that. Like I would argue Steven Soderbergh has always been a forerunner of just different technologies and mediums. You know?
Oh yeah, he fucks with that shit. I love it.
Me too. He's very creative.
Carpenter too. Maybe not with the medium, but just like I don't care. I'll be a composer.
Yep.
I don't care.
That's what he says. It's in his diary if you read it.
Oh yeah. So let's talk about neo-noirs in the 2000s and Fincher's influence and kind of why we were in love with this at the time. So Fincher's films were typically non-linear narratives, and I've explained kind of why the tools at the time kind of pushed us in that direction. And so it's very easy to include. It kind of puts to the forefront of your mind as an editor editorial devices like flashbacks or narration or nonlinear editing. Fincher's films also had themes that were very similar to neo-noir, as we talked about, like martyrdom, alienation, dehumanization of modern culture. All these things are his bag, right? His characters are troubled, flawed, unable to socialize. They feel isolated from everyone else. That's why his films are often mistaken for messianic films, because it's the same bag of tricks, but usually his messiahs are pieces of shit, right?
Yeah, he's an anti-messiah type filmmaker.
And these are all kind of things explored in Half-Blood Prince. And I'd say that in general, the darker impulses of the self came to the forefront in the 2000s. And I'd say that could probably that's a lot of things, but it definitely on the list is 9/11.
Sure.
Right.
There's
a lot to be said about the guilt of a culture. Because anyway, I'll talk about that a little bit later, like kind of in a second. It's not that Fincher or Mann or Soderbergh or Ritchie or Snyder or Nolan or Yates or any of these like white guys coined the look and thematic zeitgeist at the time. They're kind of bouncing off each other, right? That's how film grammar works, right? They followed the direction of the tools and the taste of the culture, which were seen in what did well the year before. And then its effect on cinematic culture was so massive that we couldn't stop making gritty reboots. So it was like, oh, here's this new thing. We like it. Oh, you like that? Here we go. Here's another thing. Here's another thing. We still like it, and so our tastes were being defined by the tools of the filmmakers, the filmmakers were being influenced by their tools and by what people wanted, and people were being influenced by the good filmmakers at the time. So once again, we see the chicken and the egg. Now, in a way, it kind of was always out of their control. Once we saw it as authentic and new, we kept signing up, right? And when web and TV were taking over the quality programming space, the new abnormal, which is, listen to our Dread podcast, we kind of talked about how even the modes of distribution affected this. These were things that did well. And so they lifted up the other visual artists mimicking those forms. And so that's why the visual rhetoric of the time was kind of in the eyes of the beholder, meaning both the artist and the person who is making the art, the person who's making the art and the person who's beholding the art it's that kind of conversation, as opposed to one person saying, this is the new visual rhetoric, or the audience saying, we want only this, only make these things. That's just not how it works. And so they aped each other's styles, and all these people were like around the same age, had the same perspective and diet of movies when they grew up. So there's a collective generational consciousness and therefore artistic approach. And yeah, I think that's what the zeitgeist got defined by. So when you ask the question, why is it that these films turn dark and they all kind of look like other films of that era with all the aspects of lensing, editing, color correction, etc. It's kind of that big bundle that I'm talking about. It revealed a lot about CG and green screen and mocap as well, because those technologies kind of arrived as a new box that our artists could play with, and so that's why you always get this really bumpy road at the beginning,
right?
Where it's like, they aren't really nailing it, and then Lord of the Rings comes out and you go, they fucking nailed it. Well, let's only do that then, let's make a Transformers with that. And what's crazy about the non-linear and the camera changes and the tools changing is that those kind of came out ready to go. There wasn't much of a bump and grind to figure it out. They kind of could nail it out of the gate because the tools made it so easy. So that's another aspect, is that when they're making the films, and it's increasingly easy to make something look like an Instagram filter with just a few clicks on your entire movie, let's just fuck with things and make things look completely different. And that's what I think people fell in love with. That would be my argument.
It's interesting. I mean, it's a unique movement from, like, say, how every filmmaker was imitating Spielberg in the 80s, or how a lot of filmmakers were imitating Godard. It doesn't feel like it's driven by any particular person. Although if it is, no. I'd say it's Fincher. Like, if there is one guy, I'd say it's Fincher.
Yeah, that's why I picked one.
Right.
Yeah, I had to pick one.
Well,
and
he was doing it,
and Fincher's the one.
I mean, Seven and Fight Club and The Game from the 90s are definitely precursors to this vibe.
Yeah, less so in the visuals and more so, I mean, still there, but more so in the thematic kind of, oh, we like the darker...
the grime of it.
We like our dark boys.
That's right.
You know?
But there's been, and I also think there's been, like, sort of explorations of these tools that are, how do I, about sort of committing the unreality. Like, so, like Snyder, for instance, or Sin City. A tool like those are explorations of, I would say, the same themes and the same tools and the same feelings, but then, like, trying to say something different with them. I don't think they did. I think they said the same thing, but like, you can see people trying to find individuality within it, and it's hard. I don't know why it's so hard, but it is. It's
as hard as it is to, as a director or a writer or a performer, find a unique voice.
Right.
So tools don't help you find a voice. I mean, they do in the sense that you can use them, but they're just a tool. You need to have the voice. So while people are trying these different diets of, like, new aspects of filmmaking and, like, what was going around in the zeitgeist and trying to alter and adapt for the times, I think you're right. Yeah, there's that. I think I called it collective generational consciousness. You needed to be a spike in that noise. You need to rise above all the other blips.
And you know who did that?
That were vying for your attention.
Who did that? Wes Anderson. He did. He fucking really did.
Yeah. Hey, if I ever have to pick some wallpaper.
Oh my God.
I know
right?
Or
a shirt.
Oh yeah, dude. The guy knows shirts.
Killer with shirts.
Is his effect on our world. The finding of better shirts by Wes Anderson.
No, I think the fact that you're making this case for a kind of uniform taste and a uniform sort of execution of movies, that's really interesting. Because I think you've done a pretty nice job sort of outlining all the different pieces that contributed to it, and you're going to go into 9/11 here in a minute, right? Like, that's going to happen next, right?
Well, I mean, I think I'm more or less done. I think I've said everything I want to say, but yeah, we can talk about 9/11.
The thing they really tuned in for.
You want to talk about 9/11?
I mean, you know what? Honestly, I find a lot of people's summaries about how 9/11 affected art to be a little tedious.
Or reductive, or
I don't know. I mean,
what do you mean tedious?
Tedious because it's like we kind of all know it already. I mean, I guess that doesn't mean it's not worth saying. It's still worth saying, but
that's why I didn't dwell into it.
All good.
But I'll only to say that we had it fed into the neo-noir guilt aspect, because I remember, like, 2 to 3 years after, maybe like 3 to 5 years after 9/11, we already had guilt about the war. Like, as a young kind of adult at that time, I remember in, like, 2003 being, like, against the war.
Pretty sure we killed more people
and feeling guilt about it.
I mean, pretty sure we killed more people in, like, day one than we lost in September 11th. But I might be wrong about that. But it was not an eye for an eye. I'll put it that way. And everybody could sense that. Like, nobody seems to think that was good. Like, who's back there being like, no, it was a good thing we did that. I think that's true. But also, like, 9/11 did the obvious thing that everybody always says, which is sort of like, it took away the innocence of a generation. You know, like...
Well, yeah. There's something about, like, how the mid-level blockbuster, just within 10 years, if you like a 95-ish to 2005-ish, you know, like, the stakes of all these films.
Right.
Like, we went from something like John Travolta might get so smart he might die to 10 years later, the world will cease to exist because of alien invasion. Right. And this is like our mid-tier blockbusters. Like, the stakes could never get higher. And it's one of the things we're taking the piss out of now, right? We're saying like, yeah, it's fucking every movie is fucking the world's gonna blow up. Yeah.
It's like a film critic looked at noir films from the 40s and then looked at 9/11 and said, this neo-noir thing is essentially the same thing the noir films were, which is reacting to the reality of a dark world. And it's like, yeah, that's human nature. And you
just had a war.
Yeah, I mean, like, I do think it's interesting.
A lot of people died.
Right. I do think it's interesting that Fincher seemed to be on this beat before everybody else. Now, maybe that's just benefiting from the times. Like, he was sort of a morbid son of a bitch, and then the times kind of caught up with him. I don't know.
I mean, 1999, and he made a book by Chuck Palahniuk. You know,
that was a dark movie.
That book, Fight Club, and that's a dark book.
Yeah.
And it's like, they're not the same, but like it really, the motivations for the characters and how they see the world are
There's
the same.
So much despair in Fight Club. Like, it's definitely like the world's broken and unfixable, so fuck it. Like, that's definitely the attitude of that movie. I remember feeling that very strongly when I went to the theater to see it as a kid. It was like, this is...
And if you remember the books, I mean, they get darker, but they aren't that Fincher darkness.
By books, you mean the Harry Potter books?
The Harry Potter books, they're not. They are like, the stakes are you're destroying a teenage life, and like with Harry, and obviously the world might end, so the stakes are like a Lord of the Rings or something like that. And that's much of the fantasy genre that it came from. But like, when we talk about like how much emphasis the movies put into the fact that like Harry is becoming Voldemort arc of the later films, like that is much more emphasized than page to page, like the ratio that you're going to get in the books. And I think it's because we had a fascination with the idea of self having a guilt. I think there's something. I'm not a psychologist, but there's something there.
There must
right?
be. I'm not totally sure that J.K. Rowling intended for us to wonder if Harry was becoming more like Voldemort. Like,
absolutely, she did. That's in the books.
I mean, I read the books,
but it's just not emphasized.
I read the books and I understood the Horcrux thing.
Like, he's the last Horcrux.
Right. Spoilers.
You got it.
right. Obviously, he's the last Horcrux. Obviously, that. But like, it doesn't feel like he reaches. It doesn't feel like there's ever a time where we assume Harry's going to go bad and become a Death Eater or become a new Voldemort. Like, that doesn't seem like a real tension. But in the movies, it does. Mm-hmm. Like, you saying that was like, wow, that is there in the movies, actually.
It's also, remember, as a reader, I read them. We all kind of read them before.
Yeah, I read them before.
The Darkness of Times.
Well,
so because of that, we interpreted even events where like, and then Harry used the Cruciatus curse or whatever the fuck, Crucio, and it's like, oh shit, he's going for it. But we don't actually imagine the visceral glee that's on his face when he does it, and her absolute horror, because that's like two strong actors dealing with torture, and we go, oh fuck, and like they dipped into it.
It's also J.K. Rowling's style, and I understand that we don't want to talk about her too much, but like, she writes she has a very playful writing style.
She's very on the surface of things.
But like I don't want to show her writing. I don't think she's that bad, actually. I mean, she needed an editor.
It's set in, it's Douglas Adams-esque, but not too Douglas Adams. It's polite. It's like, Harry farted, then wept. It's like, all right, we just went through a lot of shit there, JK. You gonna unpack that any?
It's
what's going on there? No, it's simplistic.
You're gonna
language.
think this is a dumb comparison, but that's okay. So like, I want to like J.K. Rowling or J.R.R. Tolkien as a writer of fantasy,
right?
Sort of has two voices. Like, he writes as Bilbo in The Hobbit, and then he writes as Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. And the point of view of the narrator, although it's very distant in both of those stories, really dramatically shapes the stakes of it. And that's because like the understanding of the character informs like what we think is happening, like what it means, what's happening. And J.K. Rowling's narrator, who I don't think is a person, it just seems to still think it's mostly happening in a school. You know what I mean? Like it's mostly still a school story, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Whereas, and the same way that like Bilbo from The Hobbit, sort of, it's really more of a fun adventure he's having than it is like a chance encounter with an end of the world type event. Like he doesn't really understand that the end of the world is at stake, whereas Frodo does in Lord of the Rings, and that's why everybody loves Lord of the Rings so much. Because Frodo's character, that as narrator, puts all this history and all this like all the stakes of what is happening in the text.
Yeah, he puts some stank on it.
Whereas J.K. Rowling doesn't. And like the best example of it is when you read the last battle of Voldemort and Harry Potter. It's very like it's like an Encyclopedia Brown episode or something. Like it's very dumb. Like they have these two long monologues over wand lightning. And they're very like, yes, I dare, Riddle, I dare. Like it's very silly and melodramatic. And the filmmakers were like, no, we're getting rid of all of that. They got rid of all of it. Yeah. They were like, no, we're gonna make like this has to be an action, and like he has to die without words. If they do talk, it's not very much, and like it needs to feel like basically the way the Lord of the Rings feels. You know what I mean? Like they went more in that direction, and I think that's why we like the movies so much. Because if we'd made the movies the way J.K. Rowling wrote it, they would have been more disposable, I think.
And Lord of the Rings was always kind of a more adult tale, yes?
Yes. It's not. I mean, it would be rated PG-13 probably. It could be rated R. It's not, but it's more adult.
Like none of these are ours. Well, none of what we're talking about are ours.
Lord of the Rings expects you to have a certain amount of understanding of human nature and sort of like the way that men are, like men and women, the way they are, and have a high view of human nature. And I don't think that Harry Potter expects that of you. You know?
Probably not. I mean, definitely not.
Yeah, I don't know.
But it definitely aged with its audience. She understood that aspect.
Yes, that was good.
Therefore,
yes, that part was good.
Therefore, you know, like it was right to go in the dark direction, and it made sense from the story because it's like this world-sweeping epic that they're literally fighting for wizard kind and muggle kind.
Well, intriguingly, I remember when I watched this movie feeling that it was the best of the adaptations. That it was the best adaptation of a book. I remember feeling that way when I watched it in the theater. And watching it now, I still think that there's some truth to that, primarily for the things you said. The noir stuff is really interesting. But it loses the thing that I've said in other episodes makes Harry Potter interesting, which is its connection to school and like the experience of being in school and a teenager. Like it really sort of loses that.
That's what captivated our attention.
That's mostly gone in this film. It's not gone in the books, but it's definitely gone in the film.
Right, because even in Order of the Phoenix, it's all about the fucking owls.
Right, the tests,
you know,
right?
The tests that they take,
they're kind of bratty.
And it's just like, ooh, who's gonna get a 5 and who's gonna get a 4? You know, like, and we're hard for that shit.
I would
be
thrilled to listen to you give a narrator commentary on the book. Just read the book and just hear your fucking comments.
Ooh, the owls! Oh, Harry's using a number 2 pencil.
Our tests are built around birds.
Yeah, it's fucking fuck. Yeah, all I'm here to say is that if you ever ask the question, why does this all look the same? You know, around 2007 and, you know, the preceding years and the years after. It's the tools, but the tools are tools. The look and the feel of films in the general got shaped by the darker appetites of the audience, which meant we came to expect desaturated, lower chroma looks. And it was penned by people like Mann and Fincher for adult films, and Yates, to his credit, bridged the gap from a child story to a young
he
adult
did do
story.
that. Filmmakers are sort of obligated by virtue of like kind of tech Darwinism to use new tech whenever they can. Like they basically have to do that.
It's a good crutch for people who are looking for a voice. I've always thought that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've used that in my career. I was like, okay, let's use these tools and the democracy of these tools. I'm going to make, a career for myself. Why? Because DSLR is here to stay. So
I think you're right about that.
we can make films with them. And I think that that's a lot of filmmakers.
Well, I think filmmakers have to be ambitious and also like they almost have to violate a little bit of their common sense in order to make the kind of advancements that this film makes. Like in some ways I feel like David Yates has to say to himself, like, I got to push this further than it feels like it should go for it to really get that dark vibe that I want.
To get attention,
At least I find that when I make when I make visual strokes that people notice and feel something about, it's usually because they've gone further than my caution tells me to go.
Because you want people to notice kind of how smart you are.
Right, of course.
How
who doesn't?
I thought there's resonance about these two ideas meeting and making a film combining this was clever and served the story. Did you see it?
Did you see that?
Did you see that? And then everyone goes, yeah.
Cool.
In fact, we saw it too much. And then you go, fuck, I fucked it up.
Exactly.
That's what being a filmmaker is sometimes. Other times you nail it and you're like, ooh, baby.
So I mentioned the movie Clute earlier when I intruded so rudely on your spiel.
Sure. What do you got?
First of all, I just love bringing it up because I know you don't care. It's my favorite.
Yeah.
So there's that. But also, Clute is an interesting example of a movie that's trying to innovate from it takes some like visual risks for like creative reasons, and they're they're cool, but they don't add up to memorable movie. And like my deep fear is that even if I was ever given a real chance to make movies, which I hope desperately someday happens to me, that I would end up making something like Clute, which I think is a good movie, but I just like it's sort of it doesn't drill into your brain the way that like say Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince does in terms of its style choices, because Harry's making like very bold, maybe sometimes aggressively bold decisions stylistically, and Clute's making intelligent, careful, scaled decisions, and they're creative, but it's also like, yeah, nobody's ever gonna notice that, man.
It's very subtle.
Yeah, that's my fear is not embracing the boldness enough.
That's what the B stands for in subtle. Yeah. Speaking of Donald Sutherland, have you seen Don't Look Now?
I have not seen that.
You need to fucking
get some Sutherland in my life.
Yeah, dude. Oh, that movie rips, dude.
Wow, that's a new one. Rips.
I think you'll like it.
I'll rip that through. I'll rip it down in front of my eyes.
Oh yeah, you will. You'll rip that rip.
I'll rip that ripper.
Get high on that rip. Well, that's all I meant to say.
I like it. I could hear more about this.
Thanks for listening.
I could hear more about this period that you've identified.
Yeah, I think there's more to talk about, but I just wanted to approach it from the tools and the zeitgeist. I think there's a lot to be said about why film noir had its, and still is infecting. I say infecting like it's a bad thing. It's still relevant.
Noir is, first of all, my favorite movie type. It's the movie type that I gravitate to when I write or want to make something the most. And it's something that can only exist in cinema. That's kind of the joy of it. Like certainly the stories can exist outside of cinema, but the feeling of a noir film is unique to that art form. Because things don't look the way they look in noir films, but they do capture feelings we all have. It's fun to watch movies that shouldn't be noir films be them, like this one.
Yeah. Even though it's in its DNA.
Yeah,
Definitely
It didn't
in its
have
DNA.
to be.
It's just
it didn't have
sneaky.
to be though, right?
Well, it didn't have to be shot in this way, like other
Right.
neo-noirs
Right.
of the time. But
Correct.
it was. And now here we are.
Talking about it.
Talking about it. And yeah, it's kind of silly. Like, I always think that we're silly.
Well, you're right about that.
But there's a wizard behind the curtain. It's not a person, but it's like there's reasons for why these things were decided, and being availed of why, or having theories as to why. I think that's like being an informed moviegoer. Because then you can watch a movie that is just like, oh, you're just doing a rote examination of that. There's not really originality in this. You're just doing that. And that's fine, but I'm not going to like lose my shit over it, because there's another film that did that already, and in fact did it better or whatnot. But when you see it, and sometimes when it's done masterfully, like a lot of these filmmakers are doing pretty masterful work in each of their, respective, films. But Yates both gets credit. I give him credit for a lot of, like, he and the Harry Potter team had a good vision of what these films should be and how they fit together. And I think that they owed a lot of credit for that. But there will always be the part of me that looks at that and says, yeah, but you're just like copying and pasting things from that and that. And, there's the whole adage about like good writing is stealing kind of thing. And I think that, there's something to both of that. Both things can be true.
I mean, yeah, I don't hate on. I think it's kind of a bold decision to do this adaptation this way.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like it's not out of place, but it definitely is
a big choice.
choice.
Especially if you go back like watch the first Harry Potter, then watch this. You're like, whoa. What the fuck happened to Harry Potter? It'll be like it's.
Oh
yeah, exactly
baby.
right.
We should have a serpentine Harry Potter night. 1, 8, 2, 7, 3.
I'm going to tell you what we should do. We should just clip out all the Alan Rickman moments and just watch them all in a row, because they're all incredible.
Potter.
He's just.
It's just a series.
Well,
Potter.
he's really like. There's a line in this movie where somebody gives him a really stupid ass excuse for something they did, and he just repeats it.
Yeah,
it's just like, God, he owns these kids. He just fucking owns these kids.
God, love to
really
see
do.
it.
You love
to see these rat-faced kids
just getting owned by Rickman's just blunt sarcasm. Yeah. You thought better, did you?
Man. If only Alan Rickman was Ace Ventura.
God, I know, dude. Can you imagine? Can you even?
For that reference, you need to look at the episode about Ace Ventura. Fuck me up, dude. That shit, too hard. You got me too much with that episode, man.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I had to shut down, and I wasn't listening to you for a while, because I was just enamored with the thought of Tommy Lee
you were
Jones
thrilled.
and Alan
You did a good 5-minute
Ace
detour on that one.
Ventura.
I enjoyed that.
Jesus.
You might have to edit
maniac.
it. That's how big of a
what
mess
have you
it is.
done? You broke me. You broke me.
I do sometimes when I'm writing my episodes think is there a way to set up Abe? is there a way to let him have some joy?
Tee him up. I gotta get in there with the jokes.
That's right.
Yep. Well, that's
Great
a sod. Let's not waste any more of these good people's time.
No.
Thanks for sticking around. Enjoy movies. That's our tagline, right? That's Directorpiece Theater. Enjoy movies.
A couple of jackasses.
And you can't see me, but I'm thumbs up. I'm giving a big thumbs up. Enjoy
a grin.
movies.
You can't tell if it's laughing at you or with you. That's old Abe.
Who knows? Abe doesn't. I'm a crazy.
This has been a Small Beans endeavor. We're a bunch of pals who make podcasts, sketches, music, web series, and movies. The Beans always have new ideas percolating, so make sure to check us out at patreon.com/smallbeans. That's patreon.com/smallbeans, where you can browse all of our current and past content, see what we've got planned in the future, and learn how your support can help the small beans grow into huge, giant monster beans. If you enjoyed this content module, please like, rate, subscribe, or tell a friend about us. We love you!